This is Grammar Points 5-2, Lesson 37, which covers that, which, who, and where. These words are also called relative pronouns. A relative pronoun is a word that refers to a noun in the sentence and is the beginning word in a relative clause. And that clause is a group of words which gives more information or modifies the noun in the sentence, gives more information about it, and it can help to make your sentences more interesting and more detailed. Because a relative clause is not part of the main sentence, the main sentence is called the independent clause, and this is called the relative clause. You could actually remove this and it would not hurt the sentence, other than taking away some detail. The most common relative pronouns are who and whom. These two words are confusing. Who is generally the subject of a sentence and whom is the object of a sentence. Whose, that, which, and from our textbook I will also include where and that. The words that and which refer to things, because again they're pronouns, they modify nouns. If it's a thing, you can use that or which. If it's a person, you use who. If it's a place, you use where. We're going to do some examples now. There are 10 sentences here. The first thing we're going to do is find the relative pronoun, and then we're going to underline the clause that it introduces. Number 1. The book that I got from the library is due tomorrow. So we know that that is a relative pronoun, and let's see how far we can go with this clause. That I got from the library, and now we have a verb, is, which could be an indicator that we should stop there, because your independent clause, the main sentence, has to have a verb, so it may not include that verb. So let's look at what's left. The book is due tomorrow. So that is the independent part of the sentence. The book is due tomorrow. So that I got from the library is the relative clause which gives more information about the book. The book that I got from the library is due tomorrow. So we could take that whole part out and it wouldn't affect the sentence. Number 2. My father, whom I respect, congratulated me on a job well done. We have whom, in this case, is the relative pronoun. We'll go, in this case, it's set apart by commas. Whom I respect, and there's a verb here, so we know that that's not going to be included. My father congratulated me on a job well done is the independent clause, and whom I respect is the relative clause. Whom is the relative pronoun. Number 3. I am always frustrated by people who talk while watching a movie. We see the word who there, and that's your relative pronoun. Who talk while watching a movie is going to be your relative clause. And we know this is true because I can say, I am always frustrated by people. And then you've got a relative clause, and nothing after that, you've got a relative pronoun, and nothing after that relative pronoun is essential for the rest of the sentence or for the independent clause. I am always frustrated by people. Who talk while watching a movie modifies which people frustrate the subject of this sentence. Number 4. The store no longer sold the computer that I wanted. You have the relative pronoun that. Which computer is it? The one that I wanted. So that I wanted is the relative clause, and the store no longer sold the computer is the independent clause. Number 5. We walked past the church in which I was baptized. You've got which as the relative pronoun. I was baptized is a relative clause. So we walked past the church in which I was baptized. Which I was baptized is the relative clause. Number 6. The child to whom you have spoken is my sister. You've got whom. Now you notice, just ignore these pronouns in these clauses here. The child to whom you have spoken, is my sister. The child is my sister. This is the independent clause. The child is my sister. But which child is it? The one to whom you have spoken. Now I say to ignore these pronouns which are showing up at the beginning of these relative clauses, because these pronouns would also occur at the end of the sentence. So I could say, the child whom you have spoken to is my sister, or we walked past the church which I was baptized in. So these prepositions have been put at the beginning of these clauses just to make them sound better, but they are not essential at the beginning of the relative clause and can also be at the end of the relative clause. So we're just going to ignore them for now. So in number 6, whom is the relative pronoun. Whom you have spoken to is the relative clause. Number 7, the tallest man who came to the show is my Uncle James. You've got who as the relative pronoun. Who came to the show is telling you which man, so that's your relative clause. And your independent clause is, the tallest man is my Uncle James. Number 8, the man whose restaurant burned down was very sad. You've got the relative pronoun whose restaurant burned down. And we've got a verb here to let you know you need to stop there. And whose is a relative pronoun, whose restaurant burned down is a relative clause. And we can check that by saying, the man was very sad is the independent clause. I can take out whose restaurant burned down without changing or making the sentence incorrect. The clause just adds more information. My first novel, which was published last year, was about my family. Now here you have, it's very easy to pick out this relative clause because you've got the relative pronoun and its clause set apart by these commas here. So which is a relative pronoun? Which was published last year is a relative clause. And my first novel was about my family is the independent clause. Finally, number 10, the hit song whose composer won an award has been playing all day. Again, you've got the relative clause set apart by these commas here, so it's easy to find. Whose is the relative pronoun. Whose composer won the award is the relative clause, and the hit song has been playing all day is the independent clause. On the previous screen, you noticed that some of the sentences or some of the relative clauses had commas setting them apart from the independent clause, and some did not. The difference between the two types of relative clauses are called restrictive and non-restrictive. A restrictive relative clause does not have commas around it, and a restrictive does have commas around it. By the way, that should generally be used for restrictive relative clauses. A restrictive relative clause, the word restrictive means that it restricts or it limits the meaning of the word. So in the sentence above here, you see, my brother that lives in New York is named Sean. That is the relative pronoun. That lives in New York is the relative clause. Now, you don't know how many brothers I have. My brother that lives in New York is named Sean. You know that one of my brothers is named Sean, and that brother is the one that lives in New York. That is restrictive. That information is important for you to understand the meaning of what I'm saying. In the sentence below, we have a non-restrictive relative clause. My other brother who lives in Texas is named Mark. Now, because it says my other brother, you know that I have more than one brother. I have one brother and I have one other brother. We know that one of the brothers lives in New York, and so now this second brother, it doesn't really matter where he lives. The other brother's named Mark. You don't need to know where he lives to define that he's another brother. So, if the information that is given in the relative clause is very important for the listener to understand or the reader to understand that noun better, then it should not have commas around it. If the information is kind of extra information that is not vital for the sentence, then you do put commas around it. Now, this is not a very hard set grammar rule. I'm sure that if you ask most people, they would have a lot of trouble deciding if something is a restrictive or a non-restrictive relative clause. And often they will always use commas, or they always not use commas, because it's often difficult to define which is which. So for your purpose, you do not really need to know the difference. What you should remember is that if the information is important, you should use that. If it's a relative clause, you're going to use that. If you see that there are commas around it, you can decide, or you can deduct, that it is a non-restrictive clause, and that information is not so important to the meaning of the sentence, and it should have commas around it. To help you with your lessons, or as a rule, if the relative clause is that, then do not put commas. If it is anything else, put commas around it. Put commas if it's that. Don't put commas for anything else.